Welcome to the SBCA podcast, Component Connection, where we explore the people, ideas, trends, and innovations shaping the market and the future of structural building components. Whether you're on the shop floor, in the office, in the yard, or out in the field, we're glad you're here.
Hello and welcome to SBCA's Component Connection podcast. I'm Sean Shields, SBCA's Director of Marketing, and I'll be your host for this episode. I'm joined by Greenlee, SBCA's Technical Director. We are roughly, 30 minutes removed from exhibiting on the show floor?
I would say about 30 minutes, and our feet are still tired.
Oh my gosh, it has been a whirlwind of 2 days. AIA 25 was the annual trade show put on by the American Institute of Architects. So Greg and I spent the last 2 days standing in a booth, talking with architects and architect-adjacent people, raising awareness of SBCA and the component manufacturing industry, gathering intel, and just trying to see potentially how to lower barriers to truss specification. Greg, thanks for joining us for this podcast.
I'm glad I could be here. Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun hanging out with you last 2 days. So, yeah, our feet are tired. What were some of your initial thoughts of the show?
Well, and we'll probably get into this a little bit more later on, but it was a very well put together show, very professional. It was a large attendance to it. It was bigger than I thought it was going to be. I think what you said, there was over 10,000.
Yeah, they said over 15,000 attendees, and when you work at all the exhibitors like us, I think you get close to 25,000.
Yeah, so it was a well put together show, I thought, and I was impressed with the quality of not only the different exhibitors that they had, but the programming that they did. It was really well done.
So let's talk about some of the conversations we had. We certainly had a lot of them over 2 days. What was one of the more interesting conversations you had?
We had a number of them, and our booth was interesting for the booths that were at the show. We were very much, there's a lot of product-oriented type booths, and we were with an association, so it was kind of an abstract or different type booth than maybe a lot of the other ones that were there, but that generated some curiosity.
There's a lot of explaining, right? People would be like, why is it that you do? Because we're not selling like the shale that they were selling next to us on one side, or the balconies on the other side.
Right, it's door handles or paint colors or things like that. There's a lot of aesthetic type things at this show, and being an association, we were a little unusual from that standpoint, but it did generate some good conversation. And I think what I found is we probably didn't have the volume of conversation as some of the other booths, but the conversations we did have were very focused and were right on the spot. So they're all quality conversations for the ones that we had.
Yeah, I didn't feel like anybody who walked in the booth felt like they had wasted their time when they walked by. There was a lot of insightful, like, oh, I haven't thought of that. Oh, that's really interesting. Or, oh, that would be good. Or those kind of things.
And I was surprised at some of the people that it drew to the booth. I mean, that I didn't expect that would be at this show. One of the engineers from APA stopped by and we chatted for a while. And then, I didn't expect that they would be at the show, but they sought us out. Same with, there was a person with the ICCES that I've been trying to get a hold of for a while. And, no idea that they were going to be at the show, but it was really nice to have that opportunity and have some conversations with them.
And they aren't typically people who would attend BCMC, right? And so to be able to find them in person, you kind of have to come to a show like this. So,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation with, I think, the managing editor of Architect Magazine, and that's a publication that, as we try to reach out to more building designers, is a publication that I was really interested in interfacing. But it's not that easy to just get in, but having them come to our booth and start having a conversation, that led to conversations about the General Light Construction and JLC Live and a bunch of live events, and even led to some fruitful conversations about these AEC live events that we want to hold that we're calling Component Ground. So we'll talk about that more later probably. And then there were opportunities for networking in-house outside of the show floor, right? I mean, like we went to a networking event that Zonda hosted. It was really interesting because we walked in and it seemed like there was a huge party going. And we're like, this is not the scene we want to be a part of. And then we realized, oh, it's off.
We were in the wrong place.
Yeah. And that was very much more entertaining.
Yeah.
Any good conversations on that?
Yeah, again, once we got into the right room with the right people, we had some really great conversations. In particular, there was an architect that we were talking to, and it was, again, just very insightful to get from an architect's perspective, his view of components, how it fits into the system, and ask them just as many questions about, what's their process, regionally, how does it vary, what do they go through, how do they make this type of selection, and it was just, in some ways, kind of affirming a lot of our suspicions or thoughts of how the process worked, but then it, again, also added some additional information.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I found both promising and valuable about being here at this show is that we got to interact with a whole slew of people that we normally never would have talked to about a part of the process that directly affects our industry, and having an opportunity to sort of open their eyes a little bit about what our industry does and where we can potentially help them if we get involved in the building design process earlier. I know that the spiel that I was going through a lot of times when I brought people into the booth was, trying to talk about the expertise of the component manufacturer as sort of that bridge between the building design and the actual construction. The component manufacturer has to take the building design and actually design the individual elements and make sure that building can exist physically, and then have to interface with the frame and make sure that it's installed and it's buildable, right? And so they learn a lot of lessons about what works and what doesn't, what's most materially efficient or cost efficient or easiest to put together. So there's a lot of that knowledge that the component manufacturer is just naturally gathering the process of them transacting business day in and day out. And that's valuable information for a building designer to have in the back of their mind on the front end as they're initially designing buildings. What kind of spans can I get to? How deep should my floors be? What can I accomplish with a floor truss versus another floor joist product, right? What can I do with wall downs? What can I do with roof trusses? Understanding the capabilities and over time interacting with component manufacturers directly, they can gather a lot of information that we never really get in schooling. And most of the time, they're not going to learn from their peers either. So if they're working on light frame construction, whether it's commercial, multifamily, single family, it really behooves them to get that education directly from our members. Right?
Yeah, and I think there was more than one time we heard the comment that people didn't realize what a resource or how valuable this could be for them. A lot of architects, the comment we would hear is that, that's something my structural engineer takes care of.
Yeah.
Which, the design of it is absolutely true, but there is a lot of interaction between that structural engineer and the architect at the beginning of the project where there is knowledge that architect needs to know. So the sooner that they can get involved in that, and like you alluded to, it deals with floor-to-floor heights, the finishes, how you're going to fit in the mechanical, electrical, fire assemblies, all that type of information. The sooner that they can get involved in that process, it's better for them. And I think as an industry, what we need to recognize is while the architect isn't necessarily the person specifying exactly what's going to happen with the floor trusses, they are the individual with the prime contract with the owner. And typically, the structural engineer will be a sub to that architect. So as the designer of record for the project, they have a very valuable role in the whole process. They have the ear of the owner. They have a lot of influence with the structural engineer. And again, the sooner we can begin that process of having that conversation with them, it's just better for everyone in the long term.
Yeah, and even in addition to that, as they're designing the building, if they're designing the building with the capabilities of components in mind, it's more likely then that the only obvious solution is going to be components in the end.
Absolutely, yes.
And, I think our industry has learned through experience that once architects and engineers do interface with component manufacturers and do find that as a valuable resource, that relationship really goes nowhere but up. That they tend to want to work together on more and more projects together, and in some cases will call out wanting to work with a specific manufacturer.
Yeah, I would agree. Most designers, once they find a resource that brings value to the equation, they will go back to that resource and continue to work with it. And that's exactly what the component manufacturers can bring. They have the expertise and the experience working with these systems. So if they can provide that value, the designers, whether it's the engineer or the architect, will continue to work with them in the future.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. AIA did a survey of architects last year, and certainly there was a lot of data that survey yielded that I think our industry could learn from. But one of the pieces that really sticks out to me was looking at the nature of architects' business. We have a tendency of thinking about, it's really all about the bid process, right? And competitive bids in most cases, except for what we were just talking about, right?
Right.
You want to be non-competitive, like you want to be part of the bid process is a non-competitive thing, right? But that's where architects mostly are at, is that most of the work that they do is non-competitive work.
Right.
That they're going back to the same client time and time again.
Right. Valuing those relationships that they've established.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you can establish a relationship with an architect who most of the time already has the relationship with the owner time and time again, like that's like you don't even need a sales team.
Right.
It's like, that's the easy month.
Yep. Yep.
So, that's kind of the end goal. We certainly aren't there right now, but that's why we're trying to have some of these initial conversations, gather some of this information. And again, it was just exhibiting in the AIA for the very first time.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, it's, some of the nuances in this industry become more apparent when you start to participate in events like this. I mean, there are architects that put together drawings. There's also design architects. There's architects that specialize in different types of projects and things like that. So you have to understand all of the different places, all the different types of architects work to really be able to, pull the full value out of that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly had conversations with the architects who were forced to do all their own draft work. And then there were architects who they don't do any drafting.
No, they just come up with design concepts, and that's their role in the equation. So
they hand it all off to somebody else.
Yep. So but that's important to understand that if you're going to be able to really work with us and get the value out of the equation.
So I mean, this show definitely had a different feel. As you point out, architecture is very different as an industry than the component manufacturing industry.
Yeah.
Right? And you could feel it on the show floor. The show floor itself, it felt a little like the build and show, in that there's a lot of products being sold there, right? It's very aesthetic focused.
Yeah. The role of the architect really is to create the experience, in the built environment. The engineer makes it work, but the architect creates that experience and defines what it's going to be like. They'll also have a lot of other things to do, with coordination of all the different disciplines, fire ratings, code requirements and things like that. But really their overall goal is to establish that experience in a building or on a street or in landscape or whatever it might be, which, like you pointed out, that's extremely different than what you would get at the builder show or our show or the structural engineers show.
Yeah, it's much more about okay, how are we getting this done?
Yep.
Right? One other thing we were talking about this, Pete Buttigieg was the keynote speaker this morning, and he loved that architect audience with sort of this idea of really looking at architects as being responsible for designing the spaces that allow people to have interactions.
Yep.
And he really painted that as a stark contrast to our social media, everybody getting all their information and interacting virtually, where there's lots of questions about whether or not people are nice to each other, whether or not there's truth in any of the interactions, that kind of thing. Whereas when we get in person, we have a tendency of then and treating each other kindly and we can actually have conversations and kind of thing. So he's really charging the architects in the room to be inspired, create these spaces that our country desperately needs to have these interactions. It's kind of a fascinating approach to talking to a room of what would you say, 5,000 or 6,000 architects sitting?
Right. Yeah. He certainly knew his audience. That's for sure. Yeah. He did a good job.
So closing thoughts, one of the fun things that we did in our booth was we had these little trusses by others, water bottle stickers. Those seem to be a good way to draw people in. But it's an interesting concept, right? To interface with architects as far as a trusses by others. I mean, when you think about that statement from your background as a structural engineer or the owning firm, what do you think about with that?
But the reaction was fabulous by the architects, because as soon as they read it, they just laughed and said, "Oh, that's so true." And that's probably been their view of it, is that someone else is dealing with this. So it really opened that door for the conversation of, here's how this conversation that we can have earlier on in the process can benefit you. Yeah, it's by others, but there is something we're the others, but there's something we can bring that's valuable to this relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Greg, we get to now go and relax a little bit, right?
Yes, I will not argue with that.
We've been putting on BCMC for so many years, and it is very different to put on a show versus actually participate in staying in a booth for 2 straight days. I now have a great appreciation for all the exhibitors at the BCMC show and what they go through. It's a lot of work to just stand in one place to talk.
It is. And I think probably the other big takeaway I had is if you want a booth that gets a lot of attention, all you need to do is bring puppies.
Yes.
There was a booth that had no less than a dozen puppies in it, and there were people around it 2 deep all day, every day.
Yeah. There's an idea that it'll be hard to bring to BCMC, but we'll look at it.
Okay.
Well, Greg, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Component Connection, brought to you by SBCA. If there's a topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode, email us at podcast@sbcacomponents.com. Until next time, stay connected.